Peter Collins was a faithful attendee of the Edenton Conference, which is where I first met him back in 1987. Like Bill, Peter stands among the pantheon of greats in the gambling studies field, and although I hadn't spent time with him in some years, I was saddened to hear of his passing. Rest in peace, Peter.
It was in the late 90s that Peter Collins gave me a call and came to my Amsterdam office. He flew in from Cape Town and was on his way to the UK, and he said, "I want you to do this responsible gambling project in South Africa for me." And so I did during a period of 3 years. And it was good and fun. He was special, very special and incomparable. It was a shock to hear he's no longer with us. I will miss him and his views and thoughts.
Peter Collins keenly understood the complexity of gambling. It was Peter's writing and lectures that inspired me to consider the vast diversity of perspectives to be explored in the study of gambling. His passing is a huge blow to our field and an incredible loss to the world.
Hello, I'm very happy to celebrate the life of Peter Collins because he was an amazing lecturer for me when I studied for my political science degrees between 1976 and 1979. I'm Irvin Levine, I live in Bristol, and I look forward to reconnecting with the life of Peter, having bought his autobiography last week and look forward to reading. Rest in peace, Peter.
Peter was a unique and deeply socially engaged person. Being an academic was just one of several ways he carried out that engagement. And that made him a refreshingly unusual and truly useful kind of academic. He was always serving his thoughtful conception of what was good. The loss of that special perspective leaves a hole in the world that can't possibly be filled, but a big and warm place in my memory.
My lasting impression of Peter is his wit, normally delivered in a stentorian baritone voice. People took note. But I'm forever grateful to Peter for inviting me to become involved in the National Responsible Gambling Program as an educational materials developer. It's something I'm still doing after all these years, and in that way I'm keeping Peter's legacy alive. Thank you, Peter.
Peter was a friend, a mentor. He was an extraordinary individual. Professionally speaking, he excelled at bridging the gap between academic research and the practical application of new ideas in the gambling industry. He would never shy away from speaking truth to power, particularly on the big stage at conferences. But it's his personal qualities that I remember most. Peter was one of the most charming, funny, intelligent individuals I've ever met. The qualities that struck me most were his courage and his kindness. He was constantly standing up for vulnerable individuals, sometimes at great personal cost, sometimes for people he barely even knew. Without question, the world is a sadder, less colorful place without him, and he'll be very much missed. Rest in peace, my friend.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to give these lectures at the Ubuntu Academy for Coaching. It's an honor and a pleasure. And as many of you will know, the best way of learning about any subject is to try teaching it. And I can only tell you that whether or not you learn anything from these lectures, I have learned quite a lot in preparing them. This course has a slightly surprising and I hope not too off-putting title, which is called Philosophy and Coaching. And I hope to persuade you that philosophy and coaching are not quite such strange bedfellows as you might originally think. Indeed, I would go as far as to say I hope to persuade you that a lot of what philosophers do and a lot of what coaches do in terms of the questions they put to themselves and their clients, as well as the answers they give, are in fact the same for both philosophers and coaches. So what is this course about? It's about exploring some of the ways in which philosophers have asked and answered questions which coaches also ask themselves and those whom they try to help. The deepest of these questions are, why are we here on earth at all? What is the point of our lives? What would make our lives worth living? What does happiness for ourselves and all human beings really consist in? How must we cultivate the kinds of attitudes and behaviors we need to recognize in order to succeed in living happy and worthwhile lives? So, what do we need to do to try to do and to avoid doing in order to live such lives most effectively? These are all questions which coaches need to work through with themselves and their coachees, having first worked them through with themselves. So what can you hope to get from these lectures? Well, I hope some pleasure. And I also hope some knowledge about stuff you didn't know before. I hope you will get some ways of improving your own lives. And I hope you will get some ways of helping others to improve theirs. The test for you, I suggest, should be, do I believe this stuff? Do I care? And will I still care tomorrow? Which, if you're interested, is what the poet Philip Larkin thought should be the test for anything you read at all, including books, novels, and poetry. So we'll be dealing with material which... Look into the camera. We'll be dealing with material which meet the Latin so-called utile dulce principle, which states the purpose of all art and all writing is to be both useful and agreeable, to instruct and to entertain, as all good lecturers, all good educators, including coaches and their trainers, should try to do. They should try to practice the utile dulce principle, which means they should try to instruct and to entertain. I also hope that you will learn enough philosophy that you can impress people at parties by saying things like, don't you agree that binging on TV series on Netflix meets the utile dulce principle better than going to see Shakespeare plays? i.e., you'll learn more and it's more fun. Well, who am I to be talking about these things? I'm someone who has studied and taught many subjects in many institutions, but always with primary, even obsessive interest in philosophical questions. What is the ultimate truth about the world and our situation within it? And how, consequently, should we try to live and to treat others? I'm also someone who has known both much happiness and much unhappiness, and much in between, but has somehow managed to keep buggering on into my 70s, and is now proposing to go on doing so. I'm someone who has been asked for advice by people with addiction and other problems, and sometimes given it unasked, without much confidence that my advice is any good and my way of giving it either honest or effective. I'm in fact someone who even founded and for many years ran an organization in South Africa designed to help people who struggle to stop gambling substantially more than they can afford, and did similar work with gamblers in the UK, where I also ran a university center for the study of gambling in all its aspects, including addictive gambling. And finally, I am someone who is qualified to join every one of the 12-step groups which focus on alcohol. AA, Al-Anon, Adult Child of Alcoholics, and probably a few more. Overeating Anonymous, perhaps. But not, it happens, Gamblers Anonymous. And not, or not yet, Narcotics Anonymous. The next thing I want to tell you about is myself and failing to get cured. Over the years, I have been offered help or advice with my various so-called psychological or mental problems, depression, relationships, as well as addiction, from many different people, including psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, priests, sponsors, family members, employers, and friends. Rather little of it did me any good, either in terms of curing me or simply making my life better. What did help was what Freud himself thought was the best therapy, namely changing my reality situation. In my case, this meant making some money through rewarding work, getting some praise, and enjoying some exciting sex. But even that didn't cure me. So what about me and recovery coaching? What did change my life substantially and reasonably enduringly for the better came from somewhere within me. I haven't a clue from where or why, but it involved a radical change in my attitude to what I wanted from the rest of my life. I therefore found very convincing the way the coaching model for helping people rejects the medical and pedagogic models which told me that I was sick and needed to be cured, or stupid and needed to be taught. I also like the idea of being helped by a coach who would start from the assumption that I had strengths as well as weaknesses, and who would help me build on the strengths while also devising ways of working round, if not eliminating, the weaknesses. This applies whether the coaching is called life coaching, business coaching, relationship coaching, or recovery coaching. So much for coaching. Now for philosophy. and particularly, to start with, what philosophy isn't. Because at this point, I realized that what I needed and what everybody needs to learn is how to philosophize better. This will surprise you because you probably think that philosophy, like science, is full of technical jargon, which makes it difficult to the point of incomprehensibility, and is in any case, unlike science, very boring. You may also dislike philosophy because you know it asks futile questions, like whether other people are actually robots, or whether we can ever really make choices. These are questions about which everyone is certain of the answers, even though they can't tell philosophers precisely how they can justify their certainty and meet philosophers' suggestions that their answers are wrong. You probably also know that philosophers ask such questions as, what is the meaning of life? But typically, you may find such questions either utterly uninteresting or so obviously unanswerable that you would rather spend your intellectual energies solving more tractable problems like, how can I make some more money? Or how can I have some fun this weekend? Those are things that philosophy really isn't. What philosophy is, you may be surprised to learn, is that the fundamental question which philosophers have always asked is, how is it best for human beings to live? Not just, what should I do now in this particular situation? But what is the best kind of life overall, which I am capable of living in the interval between my death and my birth? To answer this question requires a lot of factual knowledge about the nature of the world and about the kinds of animal we are and the kind of person we have become. We also need to know what the future might hold and what we can do about what we can do to adapt our conduct so that the future conforms as far as possible to what we would like it to be. In particular, we need to figure out how important to us are the things which most of us want, like wealth, pleasure, praise, status, and power, whether other things are more important than these, and whether these will only lead to happiness if we pursue them in particular ways and in a controlled manner. In short, we need to decide what states of affairs we should try to bring about for ourselves and for others. So bringing the two together, philosophy and coaching. It seems to me that these fundamental philosophical questions, how is it best for a person to live, and what do we need to do to live such a life, are precisely the questions to which we are constantly evolving our answers from childhood into extreme old age. The quality of our answers and the effectiveness of our conduct in trying to put them into practice is what determines the extent to which we are now living a life worth living, and one which, as we approach its end, we can look back on with a certain measure of gratitude and pride, as well, no doubt, as honest regrets. And aren't these precisely the questions which life coaches, business coaches, relationship coaches, and recovery coaches seek to help their clients to answer for themselves? What do I really want from my life? And what do I need to do to be able to get it? Easier said than done, I know, which is why it is a lifelong process. Thank you very much. End of lecture 1. Hello, my name is still Peter Collins, and I welcome you back. If indeed you are coming back, having recovered from the first lecture, or if you're coming to this lecture for the first time, I also welcome you. I should have mentioned last time that accompanying these lectures, there is a course handout which the Academy will circulate to you, which tells you really on one page 4 things. One is, what are the objectives of the course? What are the titles of the 6 lectures? How we're proposing to organize discussions online after the lectures by setting up webinars in which we can discuss questions which you have sent in beforehand. And finally, there is a section on assessments for those of you who wish to be assessed on the work you've done for this course, which is entirely optional. Nobody has to be assessed. But if you want to be assessed, you can choose exactly how you want to be assessed. You might want to be assessed by submitting a paper. You might want a multiple choice test. You might want a traditional exam, or you might want an oral exam over Skype or something. But that is all explained in the course outline, and you should be receiving that once David knows who is and who isn't on the course. Today's lecture is about the philosophy of morality, or more specifically, more technically known as ethics. Ethics is the study of the basis of moral judgments. So this is about teaching morality. Now, in the last lecture, I argued that both philosophers and coaches are doing essentially the same thing, helping people to answer the question, what is the best kind of life that I can live, and what must I do to live such a life? This has actually been recognized as the central questions which need to be answered by the thinkers and healers in all cultures of which we have knowledge: early African and South American culture, Chinese culture, Indian, Middle Eastern, classical and modern European, North American, and Australasian cultures. All cultures need concepts of what it is to live a truly happy and worthwhile life, and what people need to do to be able to do to live such a life. In other words, all cultures need a set of moral beliefs which everyone must be encouraged or required to live by. We therefore need expert teachers of morality, coaches in the very broadest sense, to teach us all the art of living well and what constitutes the right and wrong conduct which will enable us or prevent us from living good lives. We especially need moral experts to teach our children and to teach our rulers. I am henceforth going to take it for granted that the relevance of philosophical questions to best practice in coaching is now self-evident. Contact me if I am wrong. So how do moral questions arise? This is actually a question for evolutionary biology. Human being freedom of choice has evolved from simple avoidance behavior in very primitive animals to wondering how to secure the best or the worst possible life for oneself and others in the short, medium, and indefinitely long term, including whatever future there will be after you and I and they are all dead. We are animals with an exceptionally well-developed capacity for anticipating alternative futures, different futures, both in the short and in the medium and in the long term. And we are also capable of seeking to adapt our behavior now so as to bring about what we take to be the best possible future state of affairs. Rather few of our decisions are of the immediate and simple flee or fight type. Most require many, often complex decisions to get the result we want over various time periods. E.g., we have to make lots of decisions of a complicated kind about how to best prosecute our careers in the short, medium, and long term, about how to develop our relationships with loved ones, how to bring up our children. Moreover, we're social animals whose well-being depends to a great extent on success in getting others to collaborate with us in bringing about the things we want and in defending ourselves successfully against those who wish to frustrate our getting what we want, e.g. by killing, robbing, enslaving, or cheating us. So the two fundamental moral questions about which human beings, to a vastly greater extent than any other animals, have to make choices are: what states of affairs should I strive to bring about in my life? And how should I treat others while I'm doing this? Now, there really is a problem with answering those questions, and it's the problem of selfishness. Some people think that the answers to these questions about how to live the best possible life and how we must treat others in trying to live such a life is completely obvious. The best way for me to live is obviously, so they think, by pursuing whatever I want from life with whatever talents, tastes, resources, and other opportunities are available to me. And my treatment of other people should be solely determined by the ways in which they can help or hinder me in getting what I want. I should therefore never make substantial sacrifices of my own interests to secure the interests of others. And in any situation in which I find myself, I should ask only, what's in it for me? In other words, I should live a life of thoroughgoing and guilt-free selfishness or egoism. And if we happen to want our children to be happy too, this is what we should teach them. Now, at this point, I'm going to embark upon a digression into how the ancient Greek philosophers developed an early theory of coaching. in particular, how they saw the relationship between morality, happiness, virtue, wisdom, and psychotherapy. Perhaps the most famous book in philosophy of all time is Plato's book called The Republic. At the beginning of that book, which is a dialogue, a conversation between different people, one of whom is always Socrates, he asks the question or raises the question, what actually is morality? What is justice? What is right conduct in our treatment of others? This question is raised by Socrates. And one of his interlocutors, who's called Thrasymachus, says the answer's simple. Morality or justice is the interest of the stronger. Might makes right. Morality, quote, in quotes, is simply the set of rules imposed by stronger people on weaker people. And they impose those rules so that they can amass power and thereby enjoy all the things that power can secure, including all the things that money can buy. One of the other speakers, after Socrates has tried to refute Thrasymachus, says, well, let's ask the question a different way around. Does virtue pay? Does the person who lives a morally admirable life actually have a happier life than the person who lives a thoroughly immoral and totally selfish life? In particular, he compares the life of a perfectly wicked person who is ruthlessly selfish, but manages through cunning to get a reputation for being a person of great goodness and virtue. And he compares the life of a perfectly wicked man with a reputation for being good with that of a perfectly perfectly just or good person. And here he was thinking of the historical Socrates, who, though he lives a perfectly good life, is actually ignored and hated and vilified by society and eventually, as in Socrates' case, put to death. Now, says Glaucon, can you really tell me that the life of the perfectly unjust man, as I have described him, isn't better than the life of the perfectly just man? Well, eventually, after about 400 pages, Socrates tells us what the answer to this question is. Socrates' answer is that the elements of a person's life and personality, reason, emotion, and will, are integrated rather than at war and need to work together harmoniously so that a rational person's life is characterized by balance, integrity, wholeness, health, and holiness. Those words are etymologically linked. It's also characterized by serenity and blessedness, which is still, Socrates' answer, the essence of all moralities based on religion. Now, Plato's pupil, and in some ways even more famous philosopher, Aristotle, had a rather more specific answer. His answer was in terms of the relationship between what is usually translated as happiness, but actually means spiritual well-being or wellness, excellence or virtue, human excellences or strengths or virtues, and what he very interestingly calls psychotherapy. He says that the best kind of life which human beings can live is one where they enjoy spiritual or psychological well-being or happiness, the Greek word for which is eudaimonia, by cultivating and practicing the virtues and forms of human excellence, which are necessary to achieve the forms of human excellence necessary to achieve happiness, as identified and learnt through the love of wisdom, which is philosophy. And the value of philosophy is that it teaches us how to take care of our souls, which is the Greek psychotherapy. Psycho, the soul, therapy, taking care of. So Greek philosophy was all about coaching. You didn't know that. Not many people do. Well, let's answer the question, why not be entirely selfish? There's an easy case, and that's the case where our happiness depends on relationships of love. Freud famously said that mental health consists in the ability to work and to love. Most people, at least those with the rare good fortune to live in the affluent parts of the world in the 21st century, would broadly agree that having good personal relationships with family and friends and interesting, well-paid, well-respected work are the two main ingredients of what makes life worth living for them and what they most want from their lives. The satisfactions of love between romantic partners, between parents and children, between friends, and even with animals, constitute the deepest and almost universally sought sources of human happiness, and their manifold frustrations are amongst the most widespread and intense forms of human suffering. Moreover, it is obvious that it's impossible to enjoy the satisfactions of true intimacy which human loving requires and offers if one's attitude to one's loved ones is wholly selfish. The joy of requited love in any form logically depends on each partner genuinely caring about the well-being of the other, at least as much as, and often more than they care, about their own happiness and interests. Love implies a willingness, a happy willingness, to make some real sacrifices of one's own self-centered preferences in order to increase the happiness of a loved one. For example, a small example, getting up out of a deep sleep in the middle of the night in order to feed a hungry baby is a considerable sacrifice of what you actually want to be doing, but it's something that you gladly do because you love your baby and know that your baby needs to be fed. A more dramatic example is when somebody in a trench during wartime throws themselves on a grenade which is about to explode in order to save their comrades. So unselfishness, sacrificing one's own interests to secure the well-being of others, is a necessary and characteristic part of all loving relationships. Nor does love only require the virtue of unselfishness. The joys of shared intimacy are also only possible to those who are kind to each other, honest with each other, and treat each other with sensitivity, intelligence, respect, and fairness. So it is easy to see why we need to coach people in the difficult art of loving and to encourage them to cultivate within themselves the appropriate moral virtues of unselfishness. So love is the easy case, but the hard case is work. And here we need to go back to the writings of a very famous 16th century Italian called Machiavelli, of whom some of you have probably heard, because you will know the word Machiavellian is almost synonymous with political skullduggery of many sorts. Now, although Machiavelli wrote around the turn of the 16th century, no one has denied that his arguments about morality and work are even more relevant today than they were then, precisely because the greatly increased importance of success at work as a central ingredient in people's sense of their own worth and their general enjoyment of their lives. Machiavelli recognized that for many people, ambition is not important, and they are content exclusively seeking the satisfactions of the private life, in which the case for practicing Christian and other virtues, so Machiavelli thought, might not do any harm and might even do some good. However, he thought that practicing such virtues would be disastrous for people who are ambitious in the world of work and in the public domain. He thought, in fact, that many people, including himself and those he personally most admired, are not driven by a love of the private life. They are driven by the ambition to seek power, glory, fame, and fortune. For the ambitious, what makes life worth living is the pursuit of fame and fortune in competitive activities where there are few winners, as we would say today, few stars and superstars, and many losers. For him, the preeminent competitive activities in which the ambitious could satisfy their desires, their ambitions, were waging war and acquiring and keeping political power. Today, the ambitious seek to compete successfully in business, the professions, the world of entertainment, in sport, and you may be shocked to hear in academia, and so on. Now, here's what Machiavelli says about the means you need to adopt if your end is the gratification of your ambitions through success at work. He notoriously claimed that the ambitious should ignore all constraints on their behavior, which would be imposed by following the prescriptions of morality, whether based on religion or on a religionless humanism. In my view, the case he made for pure and ruthless selfishness in the pursuit of ambition has never been convincingly rebutted, except by me. Machiavelli thought that if you want to advance in a competitive career and achieve and satisfy your ambition, if not achieve, even if you don't achieve superstardom, at least you achieve a reasonable amount of wealth and a measure of social status. If that's what you want, then you must ignore all considerations of morality if they will impede the progress of your career. In particular, you must be prepared when necessary to lie, cheat, break promises, betray friends and allies, terrorize both subordinates and enemies, and resort to spectacular cruelties when necessary. But above all, you must become a genius at practicing hypocrisy, so that despite your ruthless and complete selfishness, you acquire a reputation as a person of exceptional honor and goodness, devoting your whole life to furthering the good of your customers, your clients, your employees, your shareholders, your community, your country, and the whole world. So, although you're actually only pursuing your own personal ambition for wealth, power, and glory, you pretend successfully that you're really only interested in the public good and the well-being of other people. And even it, says Machiavelli, if this is not how the ambitious should behave, even if it isn't, even if you don't agree with me that it's how they should behave, it is, he says, how they actually do behave. And if you look at South African politics and South African business, you might think he has a point. No matter how good people are at managing their public relations so that everyone believes that they are deeply moral people, in fact, they are following Machiavelli's advice and ruthlessly pursuing a selfish agenda dictated by their personal ambition. So the question is, how do we coach people about achieving success in their work without advising them to behave with the complete lack of moral concern which Machiavelli recommends? Well, I think the answer to that is to be found in the concept of vocations. People need to pursue their careers in the context of having, or to pursue happiness in the context of having not just a successful career, but also of fulfilling a worthwhile vocation. This is what true happiness in work consists in, and this is what we shall explore next week. Thank you very much. End of lecture 2. I ended by suggesting that true happiness at work consists in pursuing a successful career but only in the context of having a vocation which is intrinsically, personally fulfilling. This brings us on to today's topic, which is philosophy, religion, and coaching. It's a difficult topic for reasons that I will come to. But meanwhile, I simply want to stress that, though naturally I have views about religion, they are irrelevant to what I shall be lecturing about this morning, which I hope will be of interest and use to people, whatever their religious views are. Now, in fact, I've come to the conclusion that there are really only three types of view about religion. Many people, perhaps an increasing number of people, believe that this must be all there is. The universe and we ourselves exist for no purpose, and death is the end forever of everything that we will ever experience. Other people, many other people, and until recently almost everyone, believed this can't be all there is. The existence of the universe and of ourselves within it cannot be entirely pointless, and death cannot be the end of everything for everyone forever. Now, most of us, most of the time, now and throughout history, have spent rather little time and energy worrying about which of these two views are true and finding them either uninteresting or impossible to answer. And some of us, perhaps most of us, like me anyway, vacillate between the two views, being alternatively certain about the truth of each, even though they are quite clearly incompatible. Now, religion as such is an embarrassing subject because in modern plural societies where different people hold so many different beliefs about religion, we usually don't know whether the people we are talking to, including coaches and coachees, have strong pro or anti-religious views or are more or less religionless, agnostic, or indifferent. But because people hold their religious convictions with such passion, we usually don't like to ask them what they believe. And when we do, we often wish we hadn't. Also, it is usually thought therapeutically inappropriate to risk disturbing people's religious convictions because it's damaging to the relationship with the coach and possibly upsetting for the client. So we don't, on the whole, ask clients what they believe about religion, and don't tell them what we believe, and we react neutrally if they bring the subject up. But actually, the subject is unavoidable, at least to some extent. The primary, perhaps the sole business of the coach is to help people cope more effectively with the realities of life. So it's important to know what people think those realities are and what they think they can do about them. Thus, if this is all there is, if everything is ultimately pointless, if eternal annihilation is the destiny of all of us, an apparently pessimistic view, how, if at all, can our lives be made worth living in spite of this? Or, on the other hand, If everything is part of some cosmic master plan, which means that if and when it is finally realized, all shall be well for us, an optimistic view, how does this affect how we should live here and now? What we all want for ourselves and our coachees is for our hopes to be realistic and our efforts to realize them effective. This requires finding and passing on a way to avoid despair, for which religious faith has been the traditional antidote. Now, I want to stress at this point that I at least distinguish very sharply between good and bad religion, by which I don't mean the same as true and false religion. I mean good and bad religion. At its best, religion, even if its claims about gods and life after death turn out to be false, has unquestionably inspired many people to deeds of extraordinary charity and self-sacrifice. It has also inspired a vast amount of the beauty which human beings have created in the world, from great buildings to music and poetry. Above all, it has provided great comfort and consolation to innumerable people amidst the many sufferings to which our lives are subject, and has been the source of some of the deepest recorded experience of sheer joy. This is good, reasonable, and life-enhancing religion. But religion has also provided justification for some of the most unspeakable acts of violence in human history, from appalling wars of religion to unspeakable tortures and other cruelties inflicted on individuals in the name of religion. It has also been, and still is, a source of demonstrably false beliefs, irrational fanaticism, pathetic self-deception, more or less dangerous delusions, and an embarrassing and sometimes brutal insistence on inflicting private and mostly unbelievable religious convictions or religious certainties on those who dissent from what the believers hold to be so certain in respect of religious truths. This makes religious discussion at best embarrassing, at worst murderous. This is bad religion, irrational and destructive religion. Fortunately, coaches do not need to go into great detail into that distinction, though it's worth bearing in mind. All that coaches and everybody else needs to know about faith is this: whether you believe that this must be or that this can't be all there is, though there are good and bad reasons which can be advanced for both positions, these reasons can never be conclusive. Certainty, either way, which goes beyond what the evidence warrants, therefore requires a measure of faith. So, moreover, the ultimate truth about morality, whether it's investigated by theologians or by scientists, is that it is mostly incomprehensible to us. So if there is a God, I should expect at best to know no more about God, his nature, God's nature and purposes, than my dog knows about mine. If there are, alternative universes, as many scientists claim, I can only imagine, but never experience here and now, what it would be like to live in them. But in fact, regardless of what they believe about ultimate and eternal realities, almost everyone has faith that here and now it is possible to lead a good life and for life to be worth living. They also have faith in morality, i.e., that there really is a difference between right and wrong behavior, better or worse ways of living our lives, and that we ought, at least sometimes, to make substantial sacrifices of our present desires in order to secure the greater well-being of others. Such an ethic of unselfishness, as we have seen, is what all great religions teach, and it's also what all the most influential non-religious theories of morality actually teach. Moreover, if coaches didn't believe themselves in such an ethic, they would be useless as coaches. And if their clients didn't believe it, they would be beyond help. So back to morality. In the last lecture, I hope I convinced you that most people nowadays think that what makes life worth living is loving personal relationships and a successful working life. Overcoming frustrations in these areas is where coaches, life coaches, business coaches, relationship coaches, recovery coaches, even academic and sports coaches are most likely to be able to offer effective help. I hope I have convinced you that in all relationships of love, happiness is unattainable if you or your loved one, partner, child, parent, friend, is only interested in the satisfactions you or they can get out of the relationship and don't really care about the happiness or well-being of the other. In other words, selfishness kills the joy of loving, and true love is always, to some degree, self-sacrificial. But what about success in our work? What price unselfishness here? Last week, I left you with the challenge: how do we coach people about achieving success in their work without advising them to behave with complete lack of moral concern, as recommended by Machiavelli? Let's revisit that challenge. Machiavelli thought that the supreme good for human beings consists in the satisfactions of ambition for fame and fortune. He also thought that this required in one's public or working life behaving with ruthless selfishness and ignoring all the requirements of conventional morality, that we treat others with kindness, honesty, and fairness. He also thought that we should be expert at reputation management. In my own view, based on observation of people in all walks of life who are successfully ambitious in Machiavellian terms, he should have added that such success usually requires a massive talent for self-deception. So how do we answer this challenge from Machiavelli? First of all, there's nothing wrong in wanting to be rich and famous or otherwise successful in one's work as measured by the wealth and status that it earns for you. But if that's all you care about, you will probably be mostly dissatisfied during your working life, and you will ultimately be disappointed at the end of it. You will never have enough success soon enough or for long enough And in the end, the satisfactions which money and status afford will come to seem not only inevitably transient, but also hollow. True happiness at work depends on feeling while you're actually doing it. This work is itself worth doing because contributing to goals which are themselves worth achieving, and I am doing it as well as I can. If I also get money and praise, that's a nice to have bonus. In other words, your ambitions need to be pursued in the context of following a vocation. Now, what are vocations? Well, originally they were a concept in religion. Vocations came from God. So vocations for religious believers are literally things that you are uniquely called by God to do because of the special role God wants you to play in the realization of the divine purpose that goodness in all its forms should come to flourish perfectly and eternally in the universe. The work you are divinely called to undertake so as to make the world a better place and to contribute to ensuring that all shall finally be well may be very small and seemingly not very special. But as part of the divine plan, which only you can fulfill, your vocation is of infinite importance, and so are you. A vocation is always special to the person being called, and the work involved therefore requires a unique set of gifts, opportunities, and resources in a highly specific historical and social context. A vocation also always requires an unselfish desire to make the world a better place and must be followed with the virtues of integrity and benevolence. You cannot have a vocation to do or to be evil. On the other hand, there is paradoxically no greater personal happiness available to human beings than that which comes from doing one's best faithfully to fulfill one's vocations. But what about the non-religious? Most unhappiness at work comes from feeling that the work one is doing is pointless, that it is not making the most of one's talents and enthusiasms, that one cannot feel proud about what one is doing or the way one is doing it. And no one dispels these feelings by assuring you that you and your work are much appreciated and valued. By contrast, happiness at work consists in the feeling, this is what I was put on this planet to do, and these are the people whom I am meant to care about, and I am doing the work well, and on the whole, I am taking reasonably good care of those I am called upon to take care of. Moreover, although I am not motivated in this by the desire for wealth and glory, it is extremely nice when these things come along as well. So if you, as a coach or a coachee, believe that there is no ultimate and internal purposer in terms of whose purposes your life is ultimately to be explained, and there is no one to do the meaning when you feel that there are some people whom you are especially meant to take to care about and take care of, then accept that these are metaphors for deep truths about how you should live. In other words, if you have no religious beliefs about the source of what you take to be your vocations, act as if you had. But finally, failure. No matter how hard we try to make a success of our own lives, by faithfully following our vocations in our working lives and our personal relationships, we will often fail, sometimes miserably, and through our own fault. The good that you would do, you do not, and the evil that you would not, that you do. That's how St. Paul defines sinfulness. But he could just as well have been talking about addiction or other psychologically disordered behaviors. Religions have always recognized this and provided remedies by claiming that sin, a tendency to destructiveness and self-destructiveness, is universal and inescapable, and therefore not our personal fault. Nevertheless, we are all, especially addicts and depressives and the overly anxious, prone to compulsive acts of self-destructiveness whose harmfulness to others and ourselves we mostly fail to recognize. So what are the remedies for failure? Well, with enough honesty and humility, we are able to put our sins behind us, to forgive ourselves for them and be set free from their destructive power, mainly by ceasing to deceive ourselves in a whole multitude of ways. To become undeceived, we usually need access sources of spiritual strength by digging deep into the truth about ourselves. We also need help from others. And one of the central tasks of coaching is to help people to become undeceived. In this process of helping others, conscientious coaches will inevitably become less deceived about themselves. So that's all you need to know, I think, about religious beliefs as far as the practice of effective coaching is concerned. Thank you very much. End of lecture 3. Right, hello again. This is the 4th lecture in a series of 6 on philosophy and coaching, and in particular, what insights or techniques from philosophy, and indeed conclusions from philosophy, might be useful for coaches of all sorts: business coaches, life coaches, recovery coaches, relationship coaches, cricket coaches, and so on. Today, the subject is philosophical psychology, or philosophy of mind, or just philosophy and psychology. Now, unlike ethics and religion, the relevance of psychology to coaching is pretty obvious, or it might seem so to many, in a way that questions about morality and religion, which we've been dealing with, might not seem to be of obvious relevance. After all, psychology studies the mind in the same way that physiology studies the body. So, since much coaching is focused on enhancing the health and well-being of the mind, a knowledge of psychology is important for coaching in the same way that a knowledge of physiology is important for those concerned with enhancing the health and well-being of the body. So, what's philosophy got to do with it? Well, one important thing that philosophy has to offer, not just coaches, but actually anyone engaged in any activity, has to do with the method of philosophy, which focuses a great deal on what is meant by various terms and why we are justified, if we are, in holding the beliefs that we have. Now, this means that one crucial service philosophy can perform for coaches is to compel us to be clear about what we are talking about. For example, what actually are mental health and mental illness? And are they really like physical health and physical illness? For what it's worth, I think the talk of mental health on the analogy of physical health is actually both mistaken and misleading, especially if it promotes models of cures for mental illnesses. Crucially, also, philosophical awareness forces us to think hard about what we mean by the term recovery. Crudely, people measure recovery, in relation to addiction at least, in terms of the percentages of people who are abstinent 2 years after treatment. In fact, whatever methods are used, about 20% of people treated meet this definition. Another 20% show virtually no alteration in behavior or well-being. But in between, most people's lives get somewhat better. Most people's lives get somewhat better with more or less frequent relapses or more or less moderated and self and other destructive consumption or use. So to know whether you're being successful as a recovery coach isn't properly thought of as knowing whether you've succeeded in curing someone or failed to cure them. Most of it is about doing them some good in between those two extremes. Moreover, treatment often causes or enables people to improve their lives in ways which have little to do with their addictive behaviors. And we also need to be much clearer about what we mean by addiction anyway. For example, I have been for a long time prescribed sleeping pills, and I mean, according to one definition, therefore addicted to them. But actually, I don't regard myself as addicted to them. I simply regard myself as a habitual user. They are habit forming, not addictive. I don't get a high from them, and I don't need the ever increasing dosages to get me to sleep. And apparently insomnia is a problem for many people, most of whom solve the problem by consuming fairly substantial proportions of alcohol. So that sort of addiction, or what people call addiction, and particularly when doctors refuse to prescribe medication because it is, quote, addictive, seems to me to be one example of confusion about language which needs to be cleared up. Sorry, I've lost my place. Yes, no, I haven't. Here's the philosophy of mind proper. Philosophy of mind proper actually studies the relationship between the brain and other material objects like atoms as these relate to consciousness or the activities of minds. So one crucial question is, how does the mind, or how do the mind and the body interact with one another? These are questions which philosophical psychology, or the philosophy of mind, tries to answer, and spectacularly fails to do so. Fortunately, for the practical problem of living well and trying to help others to live well, which coaches and others are concerned with, this fact that people can't solve the mind-body problem, so-called, doesn't need to bother us. What matters to us is the way people subjectively feel and experience, not what is the current and developing objective state of the atoms which make up their brains. So neuroscience, at least so far, doesn't actually have very much to tell us of the sort that we need to know, which is mostly about human emotions. What does matter to people involved in trying to heal people, to healers, is the question of the relationship between subjective states of consciousness and objective brain states, because for one reason and one reason only. This is that we know that when states of people's feelings alter, so do their brain states, and vice versa. When their brain states alter, so do their feelings. We also know that people experiencing psychological problems or emotional difficulties are sometimes helped by medication, and sometimes also by talking, as in a coaching session. In fact, for better or for worse, more and more people everywhere are being prescribed more and more pills to overcome depressive and anxiety disorders, to say nothing of obsessions and delusions. Though rather surprisingly, they're not prescribed pills much for addictions. In fact, I don't think naltrexone has been prescribed to more than 1% of all American diagnosed addicts. So given this major increase in the prescription of pills, the question for us arises of a rather material nature: is Big Pharma about to put us coaches and other talk therapists out of business? Well, the answer is no. This fear amongst the caring professions and hope amongst the purveyors of pills is based on two philosophical mistakes. First, without asking people about their subjective states, i.e. their thoughts, perceptions, memories, and feelings, we could never know how changes in these might correlate with medically induced changes in brain states. So learning how to fix a psyche or a mental condition could, as a matter of logic, never be like learning how to fix a car or other piece of machinery. Thus, you don't need to ask a car how it is feeling after putting oil in it or changing its sparking plugs. But this is precisely what you need to do after prescribing SSRIs. The second mistake is that brain states are not only immensely complex in their interaction, in the interaction of different parts of them, but they are also highly fluid and evolve and change in response to all sorts of stimuli, including listening to the talk of others and engaging in the kind of silent talking to oneself, which we call thinking. So right now, I am actually altering the states of your brains. And I'm also altering my own brain state as I try to monitor what I'm saying and make micro adaptations to how I'm saying it. So what is the role of external or physiological interventions, drugs and the like? The question for coaches and other therapists is not a choice between physiology and psychology. It is how best to alter brain behaviors so as to facilitate healthier and happier states of mind. As yet, we know a little, but not much, about this from our scientific studies of brains, though we may hope in due course to learn more. But we do know a great deal about this from the accumulated experience and reflections of human beings over a very long period of time in a large variety of cultures, ancient and modern, Western and Eastern, well documented and preserved only in oral tradition, mystical and commonsensical. We should therefore be willing to learn from all these sources, but be naively gullible and critical about all of them, or any of them. Besides, coaches can fruitfully collaborate with other people involved in trying to make states of consciousness healthier and happier. Some conditions respond better or faster to physiological interventions, the administration of drugs or brain manipulations like ECT and surgery. They respond faster and better to those than they do to psychological interventions like talk therapies. This is true, for example, of delusions, of some forms of depression, and as I've mentioned, I think for insomnia. But almost all such interventions also require coaching type support. That is, people have to actually learn not just how to get over their depression, but how actually to navigate the difficult business of living. So coaching focuses on future goods rather than past evils. People do need to become rational and reconciled about how the past is affecting their present circumstances and future prospects. So they need to understand what happened to them in the past and what its effects have been, and how they can put the bad stuff behind them or learn from it and so transform it into good stuff. Psychoanalysis-derived treatments can help here. But, there's a big but, here's something we know about what doesn't work. One of the few things we know about psychotherapy is this. If you encourage your patient to spend much time thinking about all the bad things that happened to them and all the bad people who caused them to suffer, they will almost certainly get worse. This is because you are encouraging them, your clients, resentment, self-pity, the blaming of all their troubles on others, and discouraging gratitude, hope, and taking responsibility for the future. And note here, my favorite metaphor for this, we are not responsible for the cards we are dealt, only with how well or badly we play them. And the best players are those who know how to win with bad cards as well as with good ones. So there's a need for eclecticism in coaches, picking and choosing amongst different forms of treatment, different branches of knowledge about psychology, and different methods of treatment. Though there is much wisdom in respect of how to make our own lives and those of others go better, there is also much snake oil, and there are no magic bullets. We should also remember that even the best science is always incomplete and always provisional, and that many proposed remedies for the ills of the human condition do more, often much more, harm than good. In any case, the business of trying to help other people alter their states of mind, emotions, attitudes, dispositions, desires, so that they are better able to enjoy their lives, is not a matter of applying general theories in particular situations, nor of deducing the implications of supposedly universal dogma for prescribing behaviors to particular individuals. It is a matter, as I have been stressing previously, of following a vocation. I want to say a little bit more about coaching as a vocation. If coaching is a vocation for you, then from somewhere inside yourself, you feel a strong desire to make the world in some way a better place than it currently is. You want, in other words, to do good. And there's nothing sissy or soppy about that. You therefore need, by a process of rigorous self-examination, possibly assisted by a trusted advisor, to figure out what are the particular talents, enthusiasms, and resources which you can uniquely bring to the task of trying to make life better for particular people in particular situations in particular ways. You then need to work out how you can do this while keeping your own life going reasonably well, both your material circumstances and your own psychological development. You then need to find a context in which you can prosecute your vocation, i.e. in a job or in a private practice. But like other vocations, coaching is an endless quest of examination and self-examination, so as to do the following. First of all, update your particular objectives at particular stages of your career. Then consider the appropriateness of your allocation of time, talent, and energy to the diversity of things you feel called upon to try to do at this particular time of your life. Balancing professional and family life, balancing study and practice, balancing disagreeable chores with congenial recreation, etc. Then there's an endless quest to assess and reassess your own state of mind in relation to your work. Are you frustrated, bored, complacent, disenchanted? Or are you getting a good sense of achievement and plenty of enjoyment? Then you need to identify what you don't know and what you need to study further. And finally, you need to consider how the demands of your vocation should develop and change over the course of your lifetime. And that's why I call it an endless quest of self-examination and indeed of study. Well, are you coaches getting it right? What's the evidence? Well, there's evidence about what doesn't work, as we've already noticed. And I've now lost my place. I've lost
How
my...
authentic?
Can we have a pause while I find myself?
I can on this one. I don't think on the last one. Nope, I'm afraid not. We can't pause.
Right. Well, can I get into my PowerPoint?
Yes.
How can I do that?
So open your computer. Just minimize Zoom.
But how do I minimize Zoom?
You press that little
Make full screen like that.
Yeah.
Right. Now I can get into the PowerPoint, and now I can go down to where I was. Can you guys still see me?
Yeah.
Right. So that was the evidence of what doesn't work. Here's the evidence about what does work. Seeking help makes it 5 times more likely that people will get well than if they don't seek help. So that's good news. On the other hand, it doesn't matter much what type of help people seek or from whom. It doesn't matter whether they see super qualified psychiatrists of whatever persuasion, Freudian, Jungian, Rogerian, transactional analysts, counselors of all sorts, clinical psychologists, ministers of religion, 12-step sponsors, friends, and favorite aunts. The only necessary but not sufficient condition for getting well is that the client or the patient or the coachee believes that the person they are seeking help from really cares about them. Unfortunately, as I say, that's a sufficient condition, but it's not enough. Luck, or if you are religious, grace comes into it as well. You therefore need and your clients need to work hard at improving your luck, and your clients need to work hard at opening themselves up to sources of grace. Now, I just thought I would conclude with a couple of slides. 5 useful and under-noticed lessons which coaches can benefit from Freud. First of all, Freud said, as I've quoted before, the best therapy is a change in the reality situation. This is one reason, in my view, why rehabs fail so consistently. They don't change the reality situation, or indeed tell people how to change the reality situation, which drove them to escape from it into drink or drugs or gambling or whatever in the first place. Secondly, Freud tells us that the mind must be partly unconscious. It can't all be simply physiological in its workings. Otherwise, hypnosis wouldn't work, nor would there be a placebo effect on drugs. And in fact, rather interestingly, Freud only invented psychoanalysis because, unlike his mentor, Charcot, he couldn't himself do hypnosis. Then thirdly, but though much of our lives are shaped by thoughts and feelings of which we are unconscious, there is no such thing, said Freud with considerable anger, as the subconscious. That suggests a sort of physical model of things being on top and underneath. Whereas what Freud was interested in was the things we're aware of and the things we're not aware of, and making us aware of the things we're currently unaware of in a helpful and health-giving way. Freud was also amongst those who thought that this must be all there is, which is, you may recall, how I described the fundamental position of people who have no religion. They just think this is all there is. Consequently, he couldn't understand religion understood as the hunger for eternity, as one of his critics put it. But he did think, interestingly enough, that we could achieve a quasi-religious sense of being at one with the universe through drugs, through sex, and through creative work. He also came to believe in a version of original sin, a fundamental drive towards death and destruction, which was the opposite of the drive towards pleasure, which he called libido, and which he couldn't, but whose opposite he couldn't decide whether to call that mortido or distrudo. But either way, he thought that actually we all possess within us fundamentally destructive drives, self-destructive and other destructive. And that's a reality we have to face as therapists of any sort. He also said that all he had really achieved was to codify the psychological insights of the great writers and poets and artists like Sophocles, who wrote about Oedipus and his complex, Shakespeare, Leonardo da Vinci, and Dostoevsky, who wrote about gambling. Now, I want to conclude by quoting two pieces of poetry, which I must confess I typed up from memory, so I haven't checked them. But they give me at least a very powerful insight into what we are trying, what our condition is like, whatever it is we're trying to do creatively, but including trying to help other people enjoy their lives more. Here's what T.S. Eliot said. And what there is to conquer by strength and by submission is only what has already been discovered once or twice or several times by men whom one cannot hope to emulate, but there is no competition. There is only the fight to recover what has been lost and found and lost again and again in the general mess of imprecision of feeling. And now under circumstances that seem unpropitious, but perhaps neither gain nor loss. For us, there is only the trying. The rest is not our business. And finally, a quotation from Auden's poem In Memoriam Sigmund Freud, which he wrote after Sigmund Freud died in 1939. He says of Freud, he wasn't clever at all. He merely told the unhappy present to recite the past like a poetry lesson till sooner or later it faltered at the line where long ago the accusations had begun, and knew by whom it had been judged, how rich life had been and how silly, and was life forgiven and more humble, able to approach the future as a friend, without a set mask of rectitude or a wardrobe of excuses. Thank you. End of lecture 4.
Great stuff.
Can anyone hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can see you.
All right. Would you like us to end the lecture there, end the recording, or should we have a discussion?
I'm in your hands.
Well, I'm in your hands. I mean, I'm curious about the structure of the series, how you've structured the lectures.
Well, I'm not sure they have a structure exactly. It's called making it up as you go along, to use one of your favorite phrases. But I think the general idea is that there are all sorts of things which I've studied in the course of my life under the heading philosophy, which seem to me to be extremely useful in living one's own life, or trying to live one's own life as well as one can, and trying to help other people. And as far as there's a structure, the structure is based on the main divisions of philosophy itself. First is metaphysics, which is, I didn't use the term because it's rather an intimidating term to start off with, but that's what's the world really like. The second, which was on moral philosophy, is really, and what should we do about it? How should we live? The third was about religion, because religion is the way in which most people in the past have related the first question, what's the nature of reality, to the question, how should we live? But many people now describe themselves as having no religion. And that creates quite a challenge, because they still need some of the things that religions supplied, like a sense that their life is meaningful and purposeful. And I also suggested they need, would benefit from treating their work as if it were a vocation, even if they don't think there's anyone there to do the calling. And also in relation to religion, I stressed that although many people reject, not merely as mistaken, but as repulsive, the whole notion of original sin, we nevertheless have to live with our irremediable capacity for failure in all sorts of ways. We fail in ourselves, we fail other people, we fail in our ambitions, and we fail to pursue our vocations as fully and faithfully as we would like. And so one needs what religion used to provide, which is an analog for both sin and forgiveness, for failure and how to live with it. And then this week, I move more directly into the philosophy of mind. That is, what we're trying to alter is people's consciousness. But there are all sorts of questions about, as I've just been saying, about what consciousness is, and mistakes we can make of a philosophical sort, which it seems to me have done quite a lot of damage in the world of psychotherapy generally, all the caring professions. And
can you give an example?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the whole notion that recovery is an all or nothing affair is a classic example of something which is deeply damaging. Because actually, I'm not quite sure whether this is exactly what you teach, but one of the things I always like to ask people is, not how much do you drink or how much do you gamble, but what else do you do? And what are you good at? And what do you like? And things like that, because we are really in the business not of curing a measles-like disease. We're really in the business of helping people to live somewhat better lives than they would have done otherwise. And in that sense, it seems to me, you either say everybody is addicted to something, I mean, everybody is afflicted or addicted, or you say, well, no one's addicted, it's just the human condition. And that really changes your perspective if you don't think of yourself as a kind of mini doctor, but as someone who is more like a shaman, or maybe someone who's just basically trying to make people's lives better. I think that's likely to make people more effective. Next week, I'm going to talk about political philosophy, because coaching very definitely takes place within political structures in a highly politicized society. And that raises some quite awkward questions. But we'll get to those next week when I've worked out what the questions are and what I think the answers might be. And then finally, I'll try and sum it all up. Hello again. This is now the 5th lecture in the series Philosophy and Coaching. And today we're going to talk about political philosophy and coaching. I want to start, though, by recapping, first of all, about the objectives of the course as a whole, and say something about where I hope we have got so far. The objectives of the lectures are to help coaches and their clients to think more clearly about some of the big philosophical questions which we and our clients all periodically wonder about as we strive to enjoy and endure life as best we can. And especially, I want to help people with questions such as, why are we here? Who are we? How should we live individually and collectively? What should our goals be? How should we relate to various types of things other than ourselves, especially various kinds of other people? Is death the end? How should we prepare for it? How should we respond to the death and dying of others? Those are the big questions. But our fundamental interest, though these questions are, as I say, the big philosophical questions, is practical. We want to know how to live well in the interval between birth and death, i.e., we want to know what good and worthwhile lives considered as a whole consist in, and how to prosecute such lives as best we can. This is moral philosophy, the study of values, and sometimes also known as ethics. And to answer questions in moral philosophy, as in other areas, we need to know the facts about the world and the nature of the persons who inhabit it. For much of this, we look to the sciences. But for some crucial questions, we need to go beyond science or physics into what is appropriately called metaphysics. Especially this is true of questions such as, is this all there is? And one which is especially relevant in the context of addiction, to what extent, if any, do we have free will to choose between alternative possible futures for ourselves and for others? So why do coaches need to attend to these big issues? Well, we and our clients all think about them some of the time, and the answers we accept to them, usually unreflectingly, affect everything else we do. So we will be more effective in our lives and our work if we have thought about why we are doing what we are doing, and don't just accept unquestioningly the received conventional wisdom, even that of alleged experts. It's also worthwhile studying philosophy, the philosophical side of things, because it's always good to be clear and honest about what we are talking about and how much we do and don't know, so that we are not cowed by currently orthodox dogma or seduced into dangerous muddles by plausible rhetoric. But this lecture is about politics, which is not, for most of us, and most of our clients, a big issue, at least as usually understood. However, I'm understanding here the study of politics in a broad sense as being about everything which groups of people do together to formulate and try to achieve collective goals. And this does concern us all, especially coaches. The groups may be as small as a family or as large as the whole of humanity, with in between groups such as nations and neighborhoods, companies and teams of various sorts, as well as mutual support groups. These groups may come together for diverse purposes, notably the pursuit of safety, prosperity, health, and happiness. Coaches and their clients are parts of such groups and so need to understand how they can, should, or must relate to them in the pursuit of living well and doing good. Now, politics, in the broad sense, is simply about power. It only occurs in relation to questions. It not only occurs in relations to questions about the making and enforcing of laws, it occurs whenever relationships involve one or more people exercising power to try to get one or more other people to behave in ways other than they would choose to behave, but for the successful exercise of power. But there are many ways of getting others to do what they would otherwise not choose to do. And so there are many overlapping ways of exercising power. Coaches need to think carefully about what kind of power it is appropriate for them to employ with their clients under what circumstances. They also need to be aware that clients exercise many types of power over them, some legitimate, some which they, the coaches, need to resist. Coaches also need to be aware of the great danger of exchanging addiction to, say, drugs for addiction to power, i.e., control freakery. Now, as I say, there are many forms of power. The exercise of power to get people to do what they would not spontaneously choose to do is various. Amongst the most important forms of power that coaches need to understand, exercise, or respond to are, first, forcing. That's using physical violence or the threat of it to make people do what we want them to do. And that is indeed how laws are enacted and imposed in order to cause obedience to them. It's not usually very appropriate in relations such as the coaching one, or indeed a marital relationship. Then there is incentivizing people, that is, offering them rewards or sanctions if they do what we want them to do and not what they would otherwise spontaneously do. And many of these rewards and sanctions involve money. This is especially obvious in commercial transactions. But then there is manipulative power, exercising power by manipulating people. And what does this involve? Well, it mainly involves the use of various forms of deception, of trying to get people to do what you want them to do while believing that either you or they are actually doing something else. Then there is getting people to do what you want them to do by persuading them. that is, by using arguments. But notice that you may persuade people with bad arguments as well as with good ones, as politicians know very well. And the last one that I want to mention, though this is by no means an exhaustive list, is making use of anticipated reactions. This is the exercise of reactional power as exercised by voters and consumers. And it's very important because it's not very well understood. What it means, reactional power, is that I do something which I otherwise wouldn't do because of what I think, perhaps wrongly, you will do unless I do this. In other words, to take an example, a teacher walks into a classroom and all the children stand up. Why do they stand up? Because they think they will get into trouble if they don't, or possibly that they will be praised if they do. Now, it may be that the teacher is not one of those teachers who particularly likes formal environments, would prefer the children just to be getting on with whatever they're doing, either concentrating on their own activities or chatting to each other or whatever. But in fact, the structure of the particular school is such that there's a convention that students stand up when teachers come into the room. Well, similarly in politics, politicians, if they are democratically elected to their offices, are constantly compelled to conform their behavior to what they think their electorates want them to do, or at least will tolerate them doing, because otherwise, in the next election, they'll be voted out of office. And politicians may get it quite wrong. Namely, they may do things which they think the electorate will like, but the electorate doesn't like it and votes them out of office because of it. However, unless we understand the power of anticipated reactions, we will tend to oversimplify the exercise of power and think it only applies to the first form, or perhaps the first and second forms, that is, forcing people to do things or incentivizing them to do things. Now, ideally, coaches like teachers and doctors will actually be in the business of empowering their clients, but only empowering them to use appropriate forms of power so as to act prudently in their own interests and benignly in the interests of others. They will also, in a sense, be disempowering themselves so that their clients no longer need them. And in this, they are like teachers and doctors who will have been successful when their clients say to them, or when they can say to their clients, you no longer need my services. And that, of course, is an impressive but difficult feat for any professionals to perform. Now, coaches need something to know about the narrower conception of politics. The question of how I should live and what I should strive for may, for many clients, be answered by reference only to enjoying what we discussed earlier, namely good personal relationships and engaging in absorbing, worthwhile, and adequately rewarded work, including service to others. It may also, the question, how should I live, be answered by various forms of renunciation of the pursuit of worldly success and committing oneself primarily to the pursuit of private spiritual goods, such as serenity or enlightenment. But for most people, and many coaches as well as their clients, answering the question, how should I live, will also involve quite strong, even if largely latent, political convictions, i.e. strong intuitions about what's fair and unfair, and a strong sense of justice and injustice. You and they will also probably have strong views about whether their own society is a just one, and whether they see themselves as beneficiaries or victims of injustice, and what they think about their obligations in relation to the injustices in society. For example, by offering free coaching to the poor. In relation to injustice more generally, you and they may not be only trying to live so as to further your political ideals. You and they may also be willing sometimes to fight, to kill, and even to die for them. So the stakes in politics are pretty high. Now, this is the way things used to be when they were much less problematic. Throughout most of history in most societies, political beliefs and values were unproblematic for the teachers, healers, and spiritual advisors who tried to help people to live good or better lives in the same way that modern coaches do. What constituted a good life was laid down by religious authority, and it was the business of rulers to ensure that everybody was encouraged, enabled, or compelled to live a good life as defined by that authority. Moreover, since society was hierarchical, what constituted the kind of life you could and should live was largely determined by accidents of birth, about where you found yourself in the pecking order of society as a result of the family into which you were born. Your duty then was to love, honor, and obey God, or the gods, as well as the lords and monarchs whose right to rule over you were more or less explicitly divinely endorsed. And in return for your obedience, divine as well as human rulers would protect and promote your interests in this life, and especially after your death. Well, things are very different today. We no longer, here in South Africa and in most of the rest of the world, outside the Middle East and China, it should be said, but elsewhere, we mostly all recognize, no longer anymore all recognize a single authority, religious or political, about how people ought to live their lives. Nor do we accept the legitimacy of hierarchy and that wealth and power should be inherited, acquired through other accidents of birth, like gender or ethnicity. But having said that, what we all reject in the traditional way of deciding on values, having said that, we need to recognize that we all have very different and often conflicting ideas about how people ought to live, i.e., about what is right and wrong, moral or immoral behavior, and also about how and by whom we should be governed. Now, where these views come from Our beliefs and decisions about how to live well, i.e. our fundamental moral and political values, don't just arrive in our brains from nowhere. And we don't work them all out for ourselves once and for all when we become teenagers. We acquire our beliefs and values from the societies in which we live and what we are taught as children in families and in schools. We also modify and hopefully increase our understanding of how best to live our lives as individuals and in groups from experience and reflection throughout our lives. But so do our clients, whose political and moral beliefs and values may differ from our own, because so many traditional views about morals and politics now seek to coexist side by side. Now, this leads to the problem of pluralism. We are all, as professionals, as clients, as individuals and citizens, confronted with the problem of pluralism. We have strongly held beliefs about justice and therefore about politics and public morality, which we know many others disagree with. And we have strong beliefs about personal morality, how we should behave and perhaps urge others to behave, such as our children, especially in relation to sex, to money, and to supporting political causes. So how should we treat those who disagree with us and who do not conform to our conception of justice? Well, there's an easy answer to this, namely that we should be tolerant. Most political disagreements nowadays are couched in terms of whether the values of the so-called permissive, capitalist West, all of those words in inverted commas, are to be applauded or deplored. Some coaches and some clients will find themselves on opposite sides in such debates between so-called Western and champions of Western values, so-called, and their critics. Typically, though, this won't matter in helping people to recover from addiction or escape depression and anxiety. As with differences about religious belief, the coach will be concerned only to understand and assist, not to convert. Coaches, at least, if not their clients, will, however, need to endorse the principle of tolerance of, respect for, and even enthusiasm about different understandings of the truth about the world and how best to live in it. Such tolerance of diverse views is, in fact, what has underpinned all progress in politics and morals, as well as in science. Science made progress once people started doubting authorities and allowing other people to doubt authorities and hold conflicting and competing views which needed to be tested by experiment and experience in order to make progress. Well, the same is true about moral progress and political progress, such as we have made, for example, in no longer typically having religious wars such as those that disfigured much of the world throughout most of its history. Similarly, we no longer accept the values of imperialist domination, whatever we think the benefits of imperialism may or may not, and indeed the cruelties imposed by imperialism may or may not have been. I think more obviously, we no longer believe that children who steal because they're hungry should be hanged. Nor indeed that people should be tortured in order to get them to change their religious allegiances. So in all sorts of ways, we have made progress in morals and politics through tolerance, and coaches at least need to endorse that view. And it's not particularly difficult because everybody pretty much agrees about one basic moral and political doctrine, which is most easily labeled humanism. So both coaches and clients, whether or not they're defenders of Western values, will need to share the fundamental humanist principle, whether or not it's based on religious conviction. This is the principle that it is always good and morally right to relieve pointless suffering if we can, and to enhance our own and other people's harmless enjoyment of life before death. This is one reason why it's so difficult to help addicts who have become completely indifferent to the effects of their conduct on the suffering and happiness of others. They need to recover their basic humanity if they are to rejoin the human race. But in fact, this basic humanist principle of relieving suffering and enhancing human enjoyment underpins the politics and ethics of all societies known to us, ancient and modern, African, Asian, European, North and South American, and Australasian. The political consequence of humanist morality is that we all agree in believing or in trying to secure for our societies the political goods of safety, prosperity, freedom, and justice. Where we differ is that though we all share these the same basic humanist principle of minimizing suffering and maximizing happiness, we differ on the following: on how best to achieve this, on whether more is required by morality than this humanist principle. For example, does morality require us to cultivate piety? We disagree on whether other goods are or should be aimed at by political activity. For example, should political activity be aimed at achieving national glory or greatness? Should we be trying to make America great again? On what should we disagree? Sorry, there's another thing that we disagree on. What should we do when principles conflict? When the principle of liberty conflicts with the principle of safety, or the principle of justice conflicts with the good of prosperity. And finally, we disagree on whose well-being we should care most about. Should we care about everybody's well-being equally? Or should we put our families and loved ones first? But in the coaching relationship, as in the marital relationship, differences on these issues don't prevent the relationship from flourishing. we can coaching relationships can flourish despite substantial disagreements about moral and political issues. But there is, it seems to me, a very difficult question for coaches, to which, frankly, I don't know the answer. This is the fact that so much politics today is identity politics and an associated politics of victimhood. The difficult political problems in the coaching relationship arise when the answers people give to the questions, who am I and what are my rights, are cast in terms of belonging to some category of persons who have been wrongfully oppressed because of their race, gender, religion, sexuality, social class, etc. This causes problems because, first, it's clearly inappropriate for coaches to challenge the accuracy of these self-identifications as victims, the people who are victims whose rights have been violated. It's not for us to challenge people's right to believe that they are victims whose rights have been violated. But this sense that our clients have, that they are victims whose rights have been violated, may lead to a foundering of the whole coaching process itself, or the whole treatment process, because the client will claim, you can't understand me because you're not a man or woman, you're not black or white or gay or straight or poor or rich. And if the client believes that the nature of their identity makes it impossible for you, who perhaps have a different identity, to understand them, it's very difficult to see how you can work around that in the coaching relationship to get fruitful, constructive communication going. And secondly, it's difficult to deal with the identity issues of those who perceive themselves to be victims, because in fact, it may give them a permanent excuse for taking no responsibility for what has happened to them in the past, and therefore acquiring no insight on what they need to do differently in the future. So I conclude with a painful truth. I personally have never been able to offer any real help of any sort, material or psychological, to people who are convinced that everything that has gone wrong in their life has been entirely down to other people or to circumstances beyond their control, and never down to themselves, even in part. I find this especially true, and indeed distressing, of the poor and those who, with the best, and those who have the best reasons for complaining about their circumstances, the real victims of circumstances beyond control, such as the victims of trauma and abuse in childhood. It deeply saddens me and makes me feel helpless myself that I know of no way of getting through to these people the notion that they can still help themselves. They have not been rendered helpless. So if you know of any way of dealing with this issue, I'd be glad to hear from you. Thank you very much. That is the end of lecture 5.
Thank you. Okay. So I've just unmuted Keith, who's joined us from New York. And welcome, Keith. Thank you very much.
Right. Let me see if I can get back into so you can see me.
I can see
No. What do I need to do?
you. I can see you very clearly, Peter.
Oh, you can see me.
Oh,
yes,
yes,
I can
yeah,
see you.
I see you quite debonair sitting there, and thank you very much for your chat and your talk. It was very broad, but yet very deep. So
Thank you for that.
Yeah, appreciate that. So I guess the existential questions, who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? Are really very much at the heart of this philosophical inquiry. And I don't think I think we spend our whole lives asking those questions, and yet never finding the answers. And certainly your lecture providing the juxtaposition of understanding all of those particular questions as they relate to group formation and socialization and sociological concerns or political concerns or cultural concerns is very clear and well put. So I appreciate that as well. I think the more demanding questions are, and this is perhaps a question for you, in light of the discussion around coaching. Do you believe then that perhaps the existential crisis that might evolve out of addiction, out of poverty, out of loss, such as the loss of a family member or a spouse, something along that line, that those might be the pivotal breaking points, the gaps, the holes in the soul, if you will, that then propel someone, move someone to make a change.
Well, I like that expression, holes in the soul. I certainly think that people become addicts because they wish to escape from some form of painful reality. And one of the reasons that they relapse is because having for a time got out of painful reality, especially into such a safe place as a rehab or whatever, they then return to a reality which is indeed still very painful. And moreover, my view is that actually the human situation is a pretty painful one. It's not only painful, but it is painful. If you look realistically at what it's like to be a human being, there is much suffering to be observed. And so it's not surprising that people want to, at best, avert their gaze from these realities, but also to find ways of escape from the painfulness of it. However, I do think that part of the healing process, which coaches and others are involved in, involves encouraging people to consider whether this bleak but realistic view of the human condition is only one side of the story. That there is, in fact, much that they can still find, which will give them a strong sense of who they are, and particularly not just who they are, but why they matter in the world. One of the things I think that depresses us about the human condition is we think there's so the difference we can make to the world is so vanishingly small and transitory that there's virtually no point in trying. And I think one can actually reverse that depressing view of the world, and seeing that however small it is, however small the way in which we can make the world a slightly better place, can be a source of immense fulfillment and satisfaction, and indeed revelation, such that we no longer need the ways of escape on which we have hitherto been relying, including our various addictions. Not sure whether that exactly answers your question.
Well,
but
I think
certainly
it does.
The thoughts that your question provoked me.
Yeah, I think it does to a certain extent, and I've talked to David about this before, and the whole idea of trauma, and we're in a trauma-based society, and certainly the world is, whether or not it's implicit or explicit, whether or not it's vicarious or explicitly realized through some act, be it violence on TV or be it violence against the person. In some way or another. And I wonder, everything you say is fine from a prefrontal cortex viewpoint, from a from a cognitive viewpoint, right? I mean, if your executive function is working, your mind is smart, and you're thinking, perhaps then you can rationalize or you can put together one cogent thought and another. But I really do believe that many people are just scattered about trying to just exist. As you said, there's so much suffering, and just survival is so important, and just stepping up and stepping out is so important. And I wonder, from the trauma viewpoint, if you're not dealing with trauma, then I somehow believe that if you don't deal with your trauma, it doesn't matter how much talk therapy you might have. If you're not dealing with it on a body level, then you're not able to take responsibility or even see that you have responsibility, agency for your own life. Many people don't think they have agency at all.
Yes, I think, the question of trauma, we talked a bit about last week. I think it is important to understand as realistically as possible the harms you have suffered, particularly those in early life.
Mm-hmm.
But equally, it's important not to wallow in them. That is not to say, well, what can you expect of me given that all this happened to me? What can I do? My situation is hopeless.
Right.
The trick, which I agree is a difficult one for both coaches and clients, is to be realistic and honest about, and intelligent about, traumatic events in earlier life, particularly, but also to be realistic and honest and intelligent about how one can move beyond that, how one can see it in context. There are sort of banal things that one can usually say without, as it were, minimizing the client's trauma. But it is a fact, probably in most cases, that at least they weren't kidnapped and sold into slavery or made into child soldiers somewhere in Africa. There are, I think it's healthy to see one's own traumas and that of other people in the context of,
there's certainly a way to minimize the comparative despair, if you will. But I do believe that unless the individual is really focused in on what their traumas are and what they were, and then maybe has an opportunity to accept them and then forgive them, through this acceptance.
Yeah.
And then move on from there. They can't really take, to your point, they hold them and they guard them as their precious battle wounds, So as I always say, God moves mountains, but you have to bring the shovel,
Yes, I think the word forgiveness is the crucial one there. I think the phrase I used last week about this was taken from a poem by W.H. Auden about Sigmund Freud. It's about becoming rational and reconciled to one's past traumatic experiences. And I think that's a good one, a good phrase. The dangers, particularly for addicts, I think, as is fairly well known, is that it's very easy to fall into the trap of excessive self-pity and a tendency to blame other people for everything that may have gone wrong.
Sure.
I mean, I'm not just talking about the traumatic experience, but everything in one's life that has gone wrong.
Sure.
It is not to be, as it were, attributed wholly to the traumatic events, and not at all to any characterological failings one may be responsible for oneself or have been responsible for.
Well, as we know, our version of reality is very faulty, just as our memory and our ability to piece together events, and oftentimes it's very much colored by, where we were at that particular point in our emotional development. So, it's a very faulty machine, and I do believe that you can rewire it, and rewire it by at least allowing yourself at a certain point in life to cognitively think of the other people who were involved and perhaps their histories.
Yeah.
Perhaps also, in light of that, provide some compassion that allows you to move past that.
Yes, this reminds me of Philip Larkin's rather improper poem, which I hope you won't mind if I quote briefly.
If it's improper, even more so.
They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn. And so it goes on.
Oh, good.
Now, he concludes that the answer is to get out as soon as you can and never have children of your own. But my response to that is, they fuck you up, your sons and daughters. They may not mean to, but they do. All sacrifice they take for granted and blame their sorrows all on you.
That's very good.
They'll have children in their turn.
Yeah, that's Philip Larkin. Is that what you said?
Well, I conclude that actually, so everyone must forgive everyone else.
Uh-huh. Oh, good. Yeah, his term was "they mess you up." By the way. No, that's not. But then I do see the one, "they fuck you up," your mom and dad. That's great. So I have to read that one. Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, they may not mean to, but they do.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I'll have to pass that on.
Well, it's in Philip Larkin's collected poems.
I see it. I just
called "This Be the Day." You can Google it. It's printed in full.
Yeah, no, I haven't. And then, of course, and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens.
That's right.
To self. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids of yourself. I love that. Very good. From high windows. Very good.
Oh,
very good. Well, thank you for that. I'm not in short supply. I could talk forever about
Well, I
philosophy.
hope we will get a chance to talk again at some stage.
Oh, I would love that. I'd love that. And thank you so much, David, for making this happen. I've seen your other talks as well, Peter, but I haven't been able to make it live. So here we are. So thank you.
Good. Well, very nice to meet you online.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you so much.
Wonders of technology. Hello again. In this last lecture of the series on philosophy and coaching, I want to ask the question, so what have I learnt? This is partly for the entirely selfish reason that the best way of learning about any subject matter is to try to teach it. But it's also because I not only want to try and figure out what I've learned myself from this course of lectures on how coaches might enhance their professional effectiveness by attending to philosophical questions. I want to recapitulate, or at least to single out some highlights, which I hope, though we've mentioned them before, I hope will be major takeaways for you from this course. Now, I'm doing this because, first of all, I want to form a view for myself about the course and how it has gone. That's a fairly obvious thing. I want to identify the questions about the course where I would like to know what I think. But mainly, I want to illustrate by example how in all forms of teaching, in which I include coaching, we can carry out the kind of self-examination of what we have done so that we are continually learning how to do better in the future. And as I say, this applies to teaching sessions and coaching sessions. Now, in evaluating work, whether it's work carried out in a coaching session or any form of formal teaching, there are a number of questions that it's useful to ask in structuring that evaluation. First of all, what was I trying to do? What were my objectives? Secondly, how was I trying to do it? What methods was I employing? Thirdly, what do I need or lack in order to do it well or better? What resources did I use or do I need in order to do it well or better? Then, what were the highlights of the lectures or sessions? What were the successes, in other words, that I can build on in the future? And then, what should I do differently in the future? What went wrong? What were the failures that need to be remedied? And finally, I need to ask, what problems was I trying to solve, and where was I trying to try out new ideas and strategies to solve them creatively? If I can't answer this question, namely, how might I solve the problems that confront me better, I'm liable to get stuck in a rut, and my 15 years of teaching, say, or of coaching, say, will turn into one session of teaching or coaching repeated 15 times. So we must ask and answer these questions if we ourselves are to learn not only how to live and to do our work better, but how to live our lives better, which is the most fundamental question which philosophy gives to questions in all other disciplines, their point. And this really is my first highlight. Whatever you do, answering philosophical questions will illuminate the nature of what you're doing and what you're trying to do. Now, my objectives in considering the lessons from philosophy for coaches and coaching were overtly at any rate, the overt objections were to contribute insights from the main branches of philosophy, which may be valuable to people whose work consists in trying to enable other people to live better lives. Then I was trying to impart information about the so-called big questions of philosophy and what I believe the best answers to them to be. But in some ways, more important than offering answers to big questions and seeing whether you agree with them or not, was the matter of enhancing particular skills, namely analytical skills, critical skills, and imaginative skills, so that we can understand more clearly what we're talking about, so that we are less vulnerable to being taken in by rhetoric, jargon, and received opinion, and we are better able to see what the world looks like to people who are very different from ourselves. So, for example, an issue which exercises me a great deal is how I, as an old middle-class, westernized white male, can understand what the world looks like to young South Africans not in employment or education who have just emerged from a largely broken public schooling system. And the answer is the world must look very different to them than it does to me. For one thing, whereas I consider Nelson Mandela a hero, they consider him a traitor. And I need to get my mind around that. But there are plenty of other examples, which I'm sure you can all think of from your own experience. And then I also want to encourage coaches to engage in deeper examination of their own beliefs about what matters most in their lives and what they should be trying to do about it. In other words, I don't want you just understanding your clients. I want you to understand yourself, not just their values, but your own values. And of course, I have a covert, as we all do, objective in undertaking a teaching or coaching session. First of all, I wanted to learn about online teaching. Then I wanted to work out for myself something I've never done before, which is to work out what is the relationship between philosophical questions and questions that arise in the coaching process. Now, in my case, this is rare for me, my objective here was not to make money, at least not yet. And that's sometimes not actually just an altruistic motive. For example, when I was much involved in gambling, I wrote a book about gambling, which I reckoned might sell 200 copies and make me about 750 Rand. It was an enormous amount of work, but I didn't do it for the money. I did it because A, it would help me get a promotion, but B, even more important, it would help me get clients for my consulting work. So very often there are things which are worth doing which have financial rewards other than that which involves being paid for the work one is doing. Now, similarly, the objectives of coaches are mostly overt. We're trying to help people to identify what they really want from their lives and how they can build on their existing talents and enthusiasms in order to get what they want, and how they can address the internal and external obstacles which are preventing them from getting the things they want. And the things they want will always involve, ultimately, a matter of feelings and a desire to feel good about themselves. Then we're trying to help people, and this is very important, this, at least in my experience, we're really trying to help people to learn for themselves how to help themselves and stand on their own feet. My personal experience is that I've often tried to help people either materially or in terms of advice and completely failed because I haven't been making it clear that my objective is not simply to solve their immediate problems for them, but to help them to solve similar problems in their lives in the future without any help from outside. So we're in one of those peculiar professions, of which there are several, where our real objective ought to be to make sure our services are no longer needed. But then, in addition to that, of course, we all have a covert objective. That is, coaching is our profession and we need to make a living out of it. This suggests that quite often there may seem to arise conflicts with money and self-love on the one hand, or self-interest, and altruism, which is unselfish caring about the welfare of other people. Well, there's certainly one sense in which good coaches, sorry, I'm just dealing with noises in the background. There's one sense in which good coaches facilitate their own growth, i.e. practice self-love, in the process of trying to help others, i.e. be altruistic, to grow in health, well-being, and spiritual goods like spiritual goods such as peace of mind, hopefulness, self-respect, gratitude, and goodwill. And to illustrate this, I'm always moved by a scene in the film which was made about the foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous with Liam Hudson in the role, no, not Liam Hudson, somebody else, whose name I've now forgotten, in the role of Bill W. And there's a crucial scene, which of course was based on real life, where Bill W. was in a far away town on business, and he suddenly realized he had a desperate craving for a drink and needed to talk to another alcoholic. And by ringing around the local churches, he eventually managed to find a doctor who was a self-confessed alcoholic who was willing to see him. But the alcoholic, who was Dr. Bob, was quite clear that he was really doing this just out of compassion or possibly a sense of professional medical ethics. And so he told his housekeeper or whoever it was that after 20 minutes she was to come and knock on the door and to tell him he'd got another appointment or he'd got a phone call. So Bill went round to see Bob, Dr. Bob, and Bill started telling him his story and about his Bill's recovery from alcoholism, or at least his remission from alcoholism as he understood it. And Dr. Bob interrupted him and said, well, young man, it's extremely kind of you to take the trouble to come round and try and help me with something that everybody knows is my problem. But I can assure you, nobody knows more about it than me. And I'm afraid you aren't the first person who has come to try and help me. I have seen medical experts of every description. I have sought spiritual counseling because I'm a believer and a regular churchgoer, but I'm afraid none of them have been able to help me. My case is hopeless. To which Bill replied, no, 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 you don't understand. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for me. At which point there was a knock on the door and the housekeeper came in and said, Dr. Bob, and Dr. Bob shooed her away and said, no, 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 don't interrupt, nothing else matters. And they spent the whole night talking. So that's an example of where what is in fact seems to be altruism, that is trying to help somebody else, is in fact the best way of trying to help yourself. And so altruistic and self-interested motives are identical. But there's another story from the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous, which tells in a different direction. And this, of course, is probably well known to you. It's about when Bill and his early alcoholic colleagues were very keen to expand the work of AA and to go into publishing and hire buildings where all sorts of publicity could take place for the program, to buy up hospitals where therapy could be given based on the program, and so on. And Bill happened to know Nelson Rockefeller, who was one of the richest people in New York at the time, and indeed a great philanthropist. And Rockefeller said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll ask some of my rich friends round and you can tell us all about it. And so Bill went round to this dinner with all these millionaires in New York. And afterwards, one of Rockefeller's colleagues came up to Bill and said, that was absolutely wonderful. The work you're doing is splendid. I'm hugely impressed. Congratulations, keep it up. But we're not going to give you any money because this thing is built on love and money would ruin it. Now, I must say, I always think of that story when I think about, I think with some resentment, I'm afraid, about overcharging psychiatrists who mainly retail drugs, and indeed treatment centers, which are quite clearly and pretty ruthlessly profit-driven. You may be interested to know that in the New Testament, in the early days of the early church, there was somebody called Simon who decided it would be a good idea to start monetizing the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the gifts of grace. And so he set up shop, charging for what he claimed was access to the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And the early church didn't approve of that at all. And indeed, Simon met a very brutal and sudden and premature end. And ever since, that sin of trying to sell salvation for money has been known as the sin of simony. Well, we should be aware of the sin of simony too. On the other hand, damn it, we need money. We have families to support, and we want to enjoy all the trappings of middle-class life. We can't live on bread alone. We want curries too. So we've got to do something about money and in our professionalism, professional lives. One interesting solution was told to me by a man who is the head of the Center for the Study of Addictions at Harvard Medical School, whose name is Howard Schaffer. And in addition to his university work and medical work, he sees patients privately. And what he does is he says, you must pay for this. I don't know and I don't care how much you pay, but I expect money to appear in my account every month regularly, or I'll stop seeing you. And he left it to the client to decide how much they would pay. This is not actually very different from churches or indeed 12-step meetings, which pass around collection boxes in order to receive donations. But of course, most professionals just charge on an hourly basis. And this can cause problems because many of the people we want to help, they can't actually afford to pay the fees. So this is an issue which people have to work out for themselves. I think the only thing that I have found from confirmed, both institutionally and personally, is that whatever you do about money, you must do it at the beginning or before you start coaching, and you must be clear to secure agreement about who will pay how much for what. This means that your transactions with your coachees must be transactions between informed and willing buyers and informed and willing sellers. There must be no force and no fraud. And this, you may be interested to know, is the fundamental prescription of all economic activity. Well, let's now look at some problems of method. They're rather mundane, but they've certainly exercised me. The first one is simply, how do I transfer land-based contexts, teaching in a land-based context, i.e. a classroom or a lecture theatre, to what is virtual broadcasting? So my own objective being to learn a lot about the differences and similarities between teaching and coaching online as opposed to doing it face-to-face. That's one of my objectives. And this means that I have to think about things that are different, like, for example, the length of sessions. A positive fact that there's no need for coaches or students to take notes. On the other hand, there's a lack of face-to-face contact, and there are no body languages clues about how what you're saying is going down. I can't do what I do rather notoriously when I lecture, which is to walk about a lot gesticulating. Another problem is that I don't know anything about the audience any more than I would if I were doing a radio program. In fact, I know less about the audience than if I were doing a radio program. Now, to overcome some of these difficulties, lectures online and indeed offline should be supplemented by written material, webinar discussions, availability for individual student questions, and giving students detailed feedback on an individual basis on any work they may do on the course, whether it's written or in oral face-to-face talking. However, in a sense, none of this matters, because the greatest service a lecturer can provide to students, and it's something that is probably harder to do in some ways online, is to stimulate enthusiasm for finding out more about whatever it is that you're trying to teach people about. And I don't know how much this goal applies to virtual coaching, both in terms of its being virtual and in terms of its being coaching rather than teaching. But certainly in teaching, a very important issue, I mean, perhaps the most important issue, is the generation of enthusiasm for learning more. Now, there are some things that are obviously advantageous about virtual teaching and presumably virtual coaching. Thus, both teachers and coaches, and indeed trainers of teachers and coaches, now have hugely increased potential markets. That is, you can lecture, and I believe I am lecturing now, to people all over the world. And there is, in principle, no limit to the number of people I might be lecturing to, or who might access this lecture once it's been downloaded and made available online. This indeed is the principle behind what are becoming increasingly common, particularly in American universities, which are called MOOCs, MOOCs, mass online, I've forgotten what the other O stands for, courses. Then another advantage of online work is that recorded material can be viewed or heard when students find this convenient. Similarly, teaching periods can be much shorter and much more flexible to meet the timetables and the attention spans of individual students. Then, not unimportantly, doing this sort of thing online is much more cost effective. You don't need to hire a hall. You don't, and you can, as it were, process far more people at any one time. Another advantage is that lectures can more easily be revised and improved continuously, so that people don't just go to one lecture, and if the lecturer is not in good form or something goes wrong, then that's it. They've lost it forever. The lecture is not typically repeated and they have no second chance. Whereas online lectures can be improved and revised continually. And finally, the quality control with online work can be ruthless. This is in stark contrast to the typical evaluations you get in formal schools and universities of of land-based lecturers and teachers. And so this ruthless quality control actually, though it sounds rather intimidating, is a great boon because it creates the potential for rapid and constructive professional self-development of a high order. Right, I now want to move, in some ways, reiterating things that I have talked about in the course of the lectures, but just to pick out some of the highlights, and you can think of this, if you like, as a sort of very short revision session. But there are certainly things which, for example, I would want to stress in other contexts to other students and would be interested to know, to get any feedback from you about. First is that philosophy and coaching are both actually forms of self-help activity. It was Socrates who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And this highlights the need for both coaches and clients to engage in deep and honest self-examination. So that would be one highlight about the philosophical connection to coaching. Then the second one, which has three parts, in philosophy and coaching, we need to pay close attention to the meanings of words. We need to attend to the meaning of the words we use and which others use in speaking to us. And we need to pay this close attention, first, to avoid deceiving ourselves, and second, to avoid being deceived by others, and third, to ensure that we ourselves are not being misunderstood. Then there are some highlights which struck me about the relationship between religion and morality and coaching. First of all, as I said, there are two views about the ultimate reality of the human condition. That is the ultimate question asked by people who practice metaphysics. The two views are, this must be all there is, and this can't be all there is. When I say this, I mean this life as we know it, which seems to exist for no purpose, as does the world in which we live it, and which seems to end forever in death. Some people think that must be the truth about the human condition. But other people think this can't be all there is. There must be some point to it all, and it can't all end just futilely in eternal annihilation. And that seems to me to be the main difference between a religionless view of life and a religious view of life. Now, though there are good and bad reasons for each view, any certainty with which either view is held goes beyond what the evidence supports. And that means it requires faith. Now, the second highlight about the human condition, we are creatures. What makes us uniquely human is that we are creatures who have evolved far more than any other animals to anticipate alternative possible futures and to adapt our behavior in ways which we believe is most likely to bring about the future states of affairs which we judge most desirable. All animals are capable of anticipating very short-term futures. Even very primitive organisms can engage in avoidance behavior. Some animals can engage in, for them, medium-term behavior, especially, I'm told, elephants, who are, somebody was telling me the other day, are actually the most intelligent animals on the planet, apart from ourselves. But we, of course, can anticipate the future and possible futures indefinitely. And indefinitely means not only from here until we die, but from here until beyond our death. And that makes a difference to what we think is the most desirable possible future to try and bring about. Now, fortunately, almost everyone, whether they hold a religious or a religionless view of the world, believes that we should seek to reduce pointless suffering and enhance many kinds of enjoyment for others as well as for ourselves in life before death. Very few people believe that we should live lives of thoroughgoing and ruthless selfishness. Now, the short answer, given as I think I told you by Freud, to what is truly worth desiring in life is the ability to love and the ability to work creatively. And that seems to me to be ultimately what we want our coachees to be able to do. And this connects with the emphasis I put on the importance of vocations. We should conduct both our personal and our professional lives as if a God of love was calling us, even if there is no such God. We should live it as if such a God was calling us to use our unique combination of talents, energy, and enthusiasm to make the world, in the unique situation in which we find ourselves, a somewhat better place than it otherwise would have been. That is a noble and inspiring ideal, and to the extent that we pursue it, we find that it's also personally highly fulfilling. It has the consequence that we should put the rewards of money, status, and pleasure in our careers and our relationships within the framework of following a vocation to be a force for good in the world. In other words, there's nothing wrong with the pursuit of money, status, and pleasure in our careers and our personal relationships. But we must pursue these things within the context or framework of following a vocation to be a force for good in the world. So I now want to say something about what seems to me important about all this for effective treatments. First of all, the human brain is nearly infinitely malleable. This means, very specifically, that talking to people and being talked to, no less than taking drugs, alters brain behavior. So the charge that talk therapy has no basis in neuroscience is simply wrong. And this is why I regret the fact that too many psychiatrists seem to me to be merely expensive retailers of medication. But secondly, as I've stressed, all the research evidence suggests that the crucial variable in whether clients get well, learn to live happy lives, transform their current situation into a better one, and achieve or progress in the pilgrimage of recovery. The crucial variable for all that is that the client believes that the person trying to help them really cares about them. And it doesn't much matter who the person trying to help them is, but it's crucial that the client believes they are really cared about. Now, it would seem to me that effective treatment, therefore, consists in getting the client to consider whether what their behavior, for example, addictive behavior, suggests that they want out of life, and what they really want out of life. If what they really want out of life is not being provided by their actual behavior, what do they need to do or stop doing in order to get it? Now, I tell you a bit about my own case. For me, as I think I told you right at the beginning, I have been through many, many forms of treatment, most of which didn't do me much good. For me, to get into recovery and stay there, and I hope make some progress as a recovering addict, I needed to change my values. In particular, I needed to realize that much of my addictive behavior was connected with frustration and resentment about not being appreciated and indeed rewarded for being the stupendously important person that I thought myself to be. In other words, I had a craving for importance. And what I had to realize was that it doesn't actually matter whether I'm very important or not. Certainly, it doesn't very much matter whether I'm perceived to be very important or not. And that for me was a very important step on the road to recovery, a crucial step. And if I was going to stop craving recognition and applause and praise and those sorts of things, and appreciation, what was I going to want instead? Well, I wanted to live as a senior citizen. I wanted such time as remains to me to be fulfilling and productive in terms of work. And I wanted to die on the best terms possible with the people I most care about. So I had to completely switch my priorities in what I actually wanted out of my life. And it seems to me some sort of similar change in people's values is necessary in order to get from being imprisoned in addiction or depression or anxiety and getting into a place where one can transcend these things. But having said that, I think we all, as coaches, and indeed in respect of our own lives, we need to bear in mind another thing that Freud said, and which I've quoted, which is that the best cure is a change in the reality situation. It seems to me that one of the reasons why rehabs have such a poor track record in terms of relapses and in quite short time after people leave the rehabs is that rehabs don't, on the whole, pay much attention to anything other than what goes on during the period while the client is in the rehab. Now, in the rehab, the client is taken away from the world of work and personal relationships, which is for them so unsatisfactory that they need to escape it with some form of addictive behavior. So it takes them away from that. It keeps them for 4 to 6 weeks in a safe place. And if they can get the client to cough up, then puts them in a halfway house. But sooner or later, usually sooner, they then eject the client back into exactly the same real life situation that drove them to their addictive behaviors in the first place. And so, not surprisingly, not many make it to 2 years of clean and sober time, but many of them don't make it to 2 weeks. Now, another case study doesn't involve me, but involves 2 people I've been closely involved with, a mother and a daughter. And the mother had a serious addiction problem, but lived in a very difficult home environment, as did the daughter, where there was lots of sort of family stress, many of the problems of sheer poverty, and an inability to find work. For the daughter, the problems were really those of a standard juvenile delinquent. And why I mention these 2 is because they both, the mother over a long period and the daughter over a short period, were in and out of treatment facilities on a revolving door basis. And similarly, the daughter went from one school to another from which she played truant and so on. And it was only when they could both be moved to a different environment, in one case, a different house, and in the other case, a boarding school, it was only then that they were able, because of the changes in their real life situation, to cease seeking to escape it all the time by resorting to drugs and delinquency. Now, that's not the end of the story, because as we know, recovery is an ongoing process, and as it were, getting clean and sober for once is only the start of the process. But these stories do really strongly confirm that anyone who's been in rehab, and indeed people who haven't been in rehab, badly need the coaching process. They need to be coached so that they can be reintegrated into real life. And that seems to me to be something that in the past, before the work of places like the Ubuntu Center, has been drastically lacking in publicly and privately funded treatments for addiction and other serious psychological disorders. Well, finally and quickly, what would I do differently if I were to give this course again? Well, one thing I've been trying to do today is to do with technical issues. I try to spend more time looking at the camera and less time reading from my notes. I would also try and give the whole course a better and clearer structure. I think that was partly my fault that the structure was not, to use a wonderful word, perspicuous. That means easily transparent to the people listening to these lectures. But it was also because I didn't really know who I was lecturing to, what they wanted to hear, what they were hoping to get from the lectures, or what they were trying to accomplish. And I would structure them more clearly in the light of knowing those things. In this particular case, though normally, and I have done this myself in a long career of lecturing, I've never given the same lecture twice. I would normally need to review, revise, and refresh whatever I did last time. I don't need to do that in this case because I haven't done it before. I think more informally, I need to relax more and also to do more speaking without text. And that's one relies on a text in the same way that one relies on a kind of security blanket. I think there's a value in writing a text because it means that students have got something they can take away and see on the page, as well as simply hearing or viewing. What about substance? Well, what would I do differently? I think I would have more concrete real life situation illustrations, because I think those make rather abstract philosophical issues concrete for most audiences. I think I'd be less ambitious in terms of the content. I wouldn't try to cover all the main branches of philosophy. I would be more focused. I would stress more than I have that teaching people how to think well is essential to helping them live well. And it requires being able and willing to explore the best that can be said against what you yourself believe to be true about the world. And that might be your political views, your religious views, but it might also be your understanding of yourself. There might be evidence that, for example, you're not so smart as you thought you were, or that actually you haven't got your behavior quite under control, or that your motives aren't as pure as you thought they were. And it's a good discipline to say, well, what would someone who wanted to deny what I most passionately believe, what would they say against what I believe? And I suppose in the process of this, I would want to be more radically unsettling than perhaps I have been. I have been aware of not only not wanting to offend people, which is a reasonable thing not to want to do, but I think I would want next time to risk unsettling people's existing convictions and possible complacencies more than I have. So if there is a next time, that's what I'll be trying to do. Meanwhile, I've enjoyed this. I wish I knew more about you all. I hope we will find a way of communicating further in the future. And I wish you everything of the best. Thank you very much. End of lecture, end of course. To be or not to be, that is the question. For whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep perchance to dream, aye, there's the rub. For who knows in that sleep of death what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause, and make us rather fear those ills we have, than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sickly dour with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with disregard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action.